Last, where we share ideas to help families tackle major issues. I'm your host, Regina DeMeo, and with me today is William Kalin, who's a consultant for Homeland Security. Thanks so much for being here, Bill.
Thank you. I appreciate it, the opportunity.
Absolutely. So, I'm kind of interested in talking about privacy or the lack thereof, and I'll tell you what my mom said to me many, many years ago. She said, 2 people can keep a secret if one of them is dead.
That's correct. Yeah. There is very little privacy in the world right now. There's been numerous examples that everybody's heard of. Anthony Weiner, General Petraeus. You know, once you do something electronically, it's basically exposed to many different sources of use and businesses and things like that. So you have to be really careful about what you're putting online, how you're using your credit cards and things like that. So you need to be careful if you want to, you know, remain private as much as possible.
Well, it's counterintuitive, right? Because you think you're in the privacy of your own house on this email that nobody else can see, and so you actually have this false sense of security. I think that, you know, I've always been aware of this in the last 20 years because I've been in the legal field even when I was, you know, interning at the Manhattan DA's office in college. And so I am painfully aware of the fact that, like, when we're in litigation, I can subpoena your bank records, your credit cards. I can get access to your cell phone records. I can even copy your hard drive. I mean, my clients, when they hear that, they're a little bit in shock.
Yeah, no, all that information, which you think is private, can be, you know, obtained legally through subpoenas, like you've mentioned. Right. But a lot of people also don't realize just their general behavior and their general transactions through their credit cards, through their frequent shopper cards that they use at the supermarket. All of that information is tracked, it's monitored, and it can be sold. That's the big thing people don't realize as well. You know, when you buy something at the Safeway or the Giant, they know that you're buying, you know, Pampers or that you're buying Suave shampoo. And when you get that coupon at the end of your transaction at the supermarket, you know, that's why you get that specific coupon, because it has something to do with what you purchased. And all of that information is collected and sold and monitored. And a lot of people don't realize that once you sign up for something like that, you know, you sign the user term and agreement form.
Because we all read carefully what that involves.
And of course it's not negotiable. You know, they're not going to negotiate with every single consumer.
Right.
You know, you're automatically opted in to the collection of that information. And then they have the right to sell it to other businesses and other organizations who may want to find out what you're buying and things like that. So, you know, it's very difficult to keep things private today. You know, and anytime you do anything on the internet, anytime you use your credit card, that information is tracked. And because you signed a user agreement and terms and conditions, you've been opted in. You can opt out. But you have to go through a process to opt out. You're automatically opted in to almost everything.
Right. You
have to opt out, which means another form you have to fill out. And it takes a little bit of time, so most people never do it. And, you know.
Well, they make it really appealing. You know, some of the benefits are great, like you're getting an immediate discount at what you're buying. Or like
exactly.
Last week when it was my birthday, all these, you know, merchants were like, "Oh, happy birthday!" Right. And here's like a coupon for whatever, a free entree at our restaurant, or, you know, free mascara at Sephora. And I was like, "Oh, this is so nice." But then there's a part of me going, "Oh, wait a second, like." That's creepy that they're keeping track of my birthday.
Right, right. If you put down your birth date when you fill out a form, they're going to generate a coupon to try to bring you into the store. But that's the level, and it works. And that's the level of detail that these organizations are tracking information to.
Well,
once you do it,
if they get hacked? I mean, that happens a lot, right? I mean, some businesses have crumbled because someone has hacked into their system and stolen all this information.
Well, that exposes the consumer to identity theft, fraud, things like that. It's extremely dangerous. And if a company that you're doing business with is hacked, you obviously want to go in and change your user ID and password as quickly as possible. Hopefully they inform you as quickly as possible. There's been cases where the hackings take place and it's, you know, several weeks, several months before they go public.
Oh, wow.
Because it's a bad public relations thing, especially in the banking world, the financial world, things like that. You know, health company or an insurance company, if they get hacked, your information could be exposed. It could open you up to blackmail and things like that. So you need to make sure that if something like that does happen and you become aware of it, you take the necessary precautions in changing your user ID passwords to, try to protect it as much as possible, and try to get information from the company as to what they're doing to either prosecute the people involved, which would involve, state or local prosecutors, and what they're doing to, protect the data moving forward.
Are there federal regulations that make a company, have to encrypt certain things or do their best to prevent hacking?
There's nothing specific yet. They're working on that in terms
Okay.
of the cybersecurity rules
Right.
and guidelines and standards.
Okay, but they're working on it.
They're working on it.
Okay.
There's in the past couple of years, there's been several attempts within Congress to come up with cybersecurity rules, but they haven't completely come up with the strategy or the laws to deal with it. The technology changes so fast, and the criminals are very creative in this area because it's digital. The physical location no longer matters.
Right.
So you can be, down in the Bahamas, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, somewhere in Eastern Europe. It doesn't really matter anymore where you're physically located to commit these kinds of crimes. So coming up with the legal framework has been difficult at this point.
Yeah, no, I can see that. So, switching from business for a little while to the government, one of the questions I have is, what would make the government want to monitor somebody? What are they looking for?
Well, what's been in the news lately is the activity with the NSA, the National Security Agency. They've been monitoring a lot of phone calls. What they're going to be looking for is somebody making phone calls that are generated here in the United States to a known terrorist organization in certain countries, such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, things like that. So if you have a relative over there and you're making a lot of calls, your relative may be completely innocent, have nothing to do with terrorism, but they're going to monitor the number of calls that go over there, and they're going to potentially put you on a list of a person of interest. Okay? Doesn't mean you're bad, but if you're making a lot of calls to your relative in one of those countries, then they're probably going to start monitoring what you're doing.
Does that mean they're listening into the actual call, or they're just looking at the frequency of the calls?
Initially, they're going to be looking at the frequency of the call. They're really not monitoring the content of the calls right now, or your initial calls. But if you make a call, once a week, once a day, then they're going to start becoming a little bit more interested because, and you have to be a little honest with yourself and your circumstances. If you're calling a number in a country that is known to support Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations that have actively attacked us, then you're going to be subject to monitoring. That's just the reality of today. The goal of the government is to protect us, and when they start to see a lot of calls and a lot of activity towards one of those countries or those areas in the world where Al-Qaeda exists and things like that, they are going to monitor you. You may not have anything to do with terrorism, but that is the reality. You're gonna become a person of interest. And
how would I know when I've become a person of interest? Do I get a little notice?
when you're arrested.
Oh, okay.
No, you probably wouldn't know. But you can do things to request information, such as the Privacy Act of 1974. You can write to the NSA or the CIA or the FBI to see what information they may have on you. Some of it may be redacted or blacked out. But you can. There are some tools you have to find out what the government is doing to monitor you.
Okay.
So you have some protections, but again, some of the information might be redacted. Some of it may be remain classified for national security reasons and things like that. But the Privacy Act of 1974 allows you to inquire about what the government is monitoring for you. There's also the Freedom of Information Act, which covers government programs and policies. It's not down at the individual level, but you can submit the Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request, and say, please tell me about your surveillance, monitoring, in the city of Rockville, Maryland.
Okay.
You know, so they would have to give you some information as to what they may be monitoring. Again, a lot of it may be redacted and a lot of it may be hidden under the guise of national security, but you do have some tools as a private citizen to try to acquire that kind of information from the government.
Now, can somebody else request my file?
No. They're, as part of the Privacy Act, you can find out who or what the government may have shared with other agencies.
Okay.
But I could not send an inquiry about you, and I technically and legally I should not be able to obtain anything. But in today's day and age, we have reporters who have sources, we have leaks, we have thumb drives that I can slip to you, you know, under the table or something like that. But legally speaking, nobody should be able to acquire your information that the government may have on you.
It seems like for the employees, it might be a little tempting to tap into some of the information you're privy to. Like, oh, well, I'm starting to date this person. Let me look them up. But, I mean, please tell me there's some security to prevent from that happening.
Obviously, depending on the person's position within the government, they do have access to a lot of information. However, the protection and the checks and balances are there has to be a legal reason for somebody to look up your information. I just could not inquire about you because I'm curious. I would have to have some legal...
It's all on the blog anyway.
Exactly. I would have to have some legal reason to look up your information. There would have to be an associated legal case, a legal justification, an investigation into you, and there would have to be the specific reason for it. If I just looked you up because I was curious about you, I would be fired.
Okay.
I get fired on the spot. You know, you hear these rumors that it's hard to fire federal employees and things like that. However, this is one area where they do not mess around. If I inquire about somebody just because I'm curious, I will be fired on the spot and escorted out of the building.
Okay.
You cannot. People do it, but they, you know, they'll get caught. It might not be immediately. It might be a few weeks later. It might be a couple months later. But you know, if I looked up Regina DeMeo and I didn't have a valid reason, I would be fired. So there is some checks and balances in that regard. The government does try. Actually, the government, in some respects, tries to maintain your privacy much, much more than any private entity or private business.
Well, that's good to know.
The private businesses can sell your information.
Right.
The government, on the other hand, they're not in that business. So, you know, they try to do that. And the programs that I work on, we have to do what's called a privacy impact assessment to make sure that what we're collecting or not collecting does not violate or could not violate somebody's privacy rights. So since I work in Homeland Security, in surveillance and tracking, we have to do these privacy impact assessments on all of the programs that we work on, and they have to be approved by the legal department at the Department of Homeland Security. So we do have a lot of checks and balances. So you could actually request through a FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, our privacy impact assessments on what information is collected, say at our border crossings, at our airports, things like that.
Okay.
So that information is available to people.
Well, we're going to take a short break.
Okay.
And then we will be right back.
You know what, guys? There's a lot of tree branches and dry brush over here. We should probably move the bonfire over there.
I'm guessing Smokey liked that idea.
Welcome back to Making It Last, where we share ideas to help families tackle major issues. I'm your host, Regina DeMeo, and with me today is Bill Kalin, who's a consultant for Homeland Security. Thanks so much for being here, Bill.
Thank you again.
So I want to talk about social media and what employers are doing, because more and more I'm kind of baffled by the fact that my friends who are in the banking industry are really heavily monitored in terms of what they can access in social media or what it can post. Like in LinkedIn, they're not allowed to accept any endorsements. They can't post anything. They can read stuff, maybe accept your connection request. but they're not supposed to tweet. They have a lot of regulations. What are employers allowed to do?
Well, it varies by state to state. The state of Maryland, for example, is the first state to actually pass the Social Media Privacy Protection Bill, which bans employers from asking for your user ID and passwords. It's actually a case that originated here. Okay. They wanted to go into somebody's Facebook account before they officially hired them, and this person brought a lawsuit and won.
Wow.
And the state of Maryland is the first state to pass that. But again, it varies from state to state. But employers are monitoring your Facebook accounts, your LinkedIn accounts, your Twitter accounts. Mm-hmm. They're looking for things that can help them identify what is your lifestyle, what your liabilities might be as an employer in terms of, do you have alternative lifestyle habits or things like that? Do you post inappropriate pictures on Facebook or things like that? Who your friends are? Who are you associated with? Because companies are very concerned about their reputation. They're very concerned about bringing people that might facilitate a lawsuit for some reason against them. People who are injured a lot. Who have back problems all the time. They want to try and filter these people out. But they also want to look for people that don't have great credit records or things like that. They have poor financial backgrounds, but they can find that information out because a lot of times you're going to sign away
credit report.
Your credit report. You have to sign up or sign away the right for the employer to look at that information before they offer you the job. And in today's economic conditions, a lot of people are going to easily give up that information. And you need to think about that because, if you have a shaky financial history, do you want to expose that? Do you want to work for a company that is looking for that kind of information? Because they may not know your really intimate details or personal details about, why you may have been struggling financially. Was it because you had sick parents or you adopted a child somewhere and you spent all your money on legal fees and
or you got divorced.
Or you got divorced, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's a touchy subject because even if your potential employer does not request your user ID or password, there's nothing that prevents them from going on to Facebook or LinkedIn and looking at your profiles and seeing what you're doing, the people you're associated with, what kind of activities you do and things like that. So it's again, what you put online, there's really no privacy around that kind of information. You have to be very careful if you don't want to share that information. Don't create the accounts and things like that. But once it's online, it's very, very difficult to erase or get rid of.
Yeah, no, and I heard that now credit agencies are actually tracking who you're friends with. Right?
Yes.
I mean, it used to be back in the day, if I was friends with you, nobody necessarily knew that we were
Exactly.
friends unless we said something.
Mm-hmm.
But now, actually there's a pretty good record of who we're all friends with, who we're connected to. And now my credit might get dinged because of something you did. I don't understand that.
Yeah, that's complicated. I actually have a good friend who runs a credit counseling service, and he's asked me to like his company's website on Facebook, and I won't do it just because I don't want to be associated with a credit counseling company. Mm-hmm. He's one of my best friends, but I just don't need that association because of the type of work I do and the background clearances that I need to go through. I don't want to be associated with credit counseling, which is in my field viewed as problematic because it means I have financial issues.
Oh my God.
Because I have to go through background clearances, and one of the biggest causes of a rejection for a background clearance is poor financial status or bankruptcy or things like that, because you can be subject to blackmail. So in my career with Homeland Security, I simply do not want to be associated with a credit counseling company.
No, that makes perfect sense, but it's just crazy the kinds of things that people are tracking these days.
Yes, and again, once you create that transaction, whether it's just registering for the site or not, it's online, and people can find that information out. And the sites are also starting to look at your keywords that you're putting in, the frequency of words and things like that. So, for example,
for ads, right?
For ads and things like that. So, for example, if you have a Google Mail account, if you start to communicate with an attorney, You're going to start to see banner ads up top for legal services. If you potentially communicate...
Because they're looking at the content
They're
of the
looking at the
emails?
keywords.
Wow.
Let's say I had a communication with you and I inquired about malpractice or divorce or something like that.
Right.
I would start to see banner ads up top on Google Mail for legal services, for malpractice, medical services, things like that, divorce services, family law. I see those ads now. So that's popping up. Facebook is starting to do the same thing. They're looking at what kind of postings you make, what kind of companies you like, and they generate ads and post those to your site. So that's why you'll get certain coupons and things like that.
No, I think it all stems from a good point of view. Like, oh, well, this person may want a recommendation for, whatever, this kind of service. Just like Netflix. In the beginning, I was like, oh, yeah, give this movie 5 stars. And then they would send me recommendations. Because you like this movie, you may like that movie.
Exactly.
The problem is that the more information people amass, and if it's not being controlled, you don't know how that's going to be used.
And Amazon does the same thing. When you sign on to Amazon,
right.
Oh, you may like this, or people who bought this product recently bought this product, and things like that. So, that's how everything works, and everything is recorded in that regard. So you need to be really careful about, what you may do or may not do online.
What would you recommend to somebody who really, for me, obviously, that ship has sailed. I'm a pretty public person at this point. So I'm okay with that. But I have friends who are very, very private. They're in the government. They're high up. And they don't really want people knowing about anything about their kids. They don't want anything up there about where they live. How would you, recommend to somebody that they, what should they do to keep their stuff private?
Well, you need to keep what I would call a small digital footprint. Try not to do a lot of transactions online. It's going to be hard to. But your children's records, your school records, those are supposed to remain private. Those are not available for public consumption and things like that. Your address is probably going to be hard to hide because it's in the public records for a deed or some kind of mortgage, things like that. If you own.
Right.
Unfortunately, when you get a mortgage, the mortgage company takes your information, packages it up, and sells it. That's why when you move, you suddenly get all kinds of offers for, you recently moved. Somebody sold that information, and it's most likely originating, believe it or not, the post office, the United States Post Office, because you put in a change of address.
Right.
Or one of the utility companies because you need to turn on electricity or whatever, water. It's originating from the mortgage company. And again, they're going to be selling your demographic to another company that's interested in your services. So depending on your income, your mortgage, you're going to start to get offers from companies interested in your income levels and things like that, where you're living in Potomac, things like that. So that all gets packaged up and sold, and you think it's not even an online transaction. You're sitting there filling out 50 sheets of paper at your mortgage broker, but that information gets sold. And again, we mentioned earlier the opt-out provisions.
Yeah.
You do have those opt-out provisions, but you really specifically need to ask for it. You need to fill out additional forms, and you need to make sure it gets submitted. Otherwise, you're automatically opted in. So the best thing to do is opt out of as many things as possible. You can opt out of direct mailing or junk mail services. You can opt out of the do not call list and things like that. So those are things that would help minimize your information out online and what's out there available for you. But it's a proactive process. You have to undertake an activity to remove yourself from these kinds of lists and things like that.
Interesting.
It's you can minimize your information, but again, you have to be proactive about it.
In Petraeus' case, right, which I had to comment on, they came up with a concept that I thought was kind of genius. They didn't send emails.
Correct.
They just had them in draft. They
Correct.
each had the passwords. They could go into the account, read the draft emails, right? And yet, those were discovered.
Yes, because
how did that happen?
In the case of General Petraeus, they created a Google Mail account, and they would create a message and save it as a draft, and they would each go in and read the draft. Technically, they never sent emails.
Right.
Okay? They never sent emails. But They created an electronic record which was stored on a Google server somewhere that allowed the investigators to go in and find it. There's another component to that case too. A lot of the phone calls that his mistress made originated from a certain brand of hotels.
Okay.
And they started to notice when they did the basic investigations that there was this pattern to these phone numbers. They all came from a specific brand of hotel. So when they got the guest list from those hotels, one name started showing up. So, basic investigative footwork there, but, she wasn't using her cell phone. She was using the hotel phone, thinking that it would create a level of anonymity.
Right.
But, because it was the same brand, hotel, and she was the consistent guest across these hotels, they were able to link this together. So making phone calls from, your hotel room doesn't necessarily protect you either. There's a record.
Well, I'm not going to feel too sorry for them. There's a couple things that I don't think people understand. But number one, he's a pretty high level, or was
Yeah.
a high level person, and with an extreme security clearance. And now, if he's having an affair, that makes him subject to blackmail.
Correct.
So that is not only a violation of military law, having an affair, but also a huge breach of national security. So I'm glad they caught him. I'm
Yep.
really not sympathetic at all to his plight right now. His wife, whole different story.
Yeah, that's different. The average citizen really has nothing to worry about.
Okay.
They're not monitoring your phone calls for content and things like that. If you're not doing anything illegal,
You're fine.
don't worry about it.
Okay.
Okay, you're going to be fine. But if you're doing something illegal, you're going to try to want to hide it. You're going to do something, but you're going to get caught. There's going to be an electronic record of it. So in today's day and age, there's a lot of people very concerned about privacy and what is being tracked by, the CIA, the NSA, or whatever federal government agency they're afraid of. But if you're not doing anything illegal, just don't worry about it. It's hard for people to understand that. But in today's day and age, we have people who want to kill us every single day.
Right.
We know where they generally reside in certain countries. So if you're making calls to those countries, you might just become a person of interest, like we mentioned earlier.
Right.
But if you're calling your aunt, your cousin, or whomever lives over there, and they have nothing to do with terrorism, then you don't worry about it.
Right.
Will you be on a list of phone calls that get monitored? Yes. Is there anything you can do about it? No. But, you're not doing anything illegal. That's the big thing.
I think the best takeaway is, right, you guys need to do your job to keep us safe. But the thing people really need to focus on more is what the businesses out there are doing with our information.
That's scarier to me than what the federal government does.
Yeah.
Businesses, as we've mentioned, once you create that transaction, and supermarkets are one of the best at doing this. You use your Giant card, your Safeway card. They're tracking all of those purchases, and they know what you're buying and things like that. With your credit cards, they're going to know how often you go to the liquor store, how often you're buying wine, how often you're buying flowers, things like that. Are you buying jewelry? What are you buying? And that information can be obtained by a lawyer if there is an issue with divorce, if somebody suspects you of infidelity. Watch how many flowers you buy. Watch how many
I say
things
that
you
all
buy.
the time.
Jewelry, hotels, all of that.
This has been great. If somebody wanted to contact you for further information, how would they do that?
The best way to reach me would be to call me on my cell phone, which, of course, if you leave a voicemail, will be recorded, at 703-283-2835.
Awesome. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on Making It Last.